This is Violet Claire Lewis. She was born on the 12th of June, 1885, so she is now 95 years old. Now, one of Mrs. Lewis's 5 sons married this lady. She's Nisa Fanny Priscilla Lewis, and she was born on the 7th of December, 1901, so she is now 79. And this Mrs. Lewis, over here, is this Mrs. Lewis's mother-in-law. Now, this Mrs. Lewis had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and this one, Edna Violet Doris, who was born on the 18th of August 1923, married a Mr. Bastin. So this Mrs. Lewis is her mother, and this Mrs. Lewis is her grandmother. Now, Mrs. Bastin had 3 daughters, and this one, Pauline Winifred, born on the 10th of November 1944, married a Mr. Peter Ward. So Mrs. Bastin is her mother, Mrs. Lewis is her grandmother, and this Mrs. Lewis is her great-grandmother. Right. Now, Mrs. Ward had 2 sons and 2 daughters, and this one, Mandy, born on the 3rd of May 1963, married a Mr. Perry Boggins. So Mrs. Ward is her mother, and Mrs. Bastin is her grandmother, and Mrs. Lewis is her great-grandmother, and this Mrs. Lewis is her great-great-grandmother. Now, on the 10th of May this year, 1980, Mrs. Boggins gave birth to a son, Philip Peter. And this is him. There, Philip Peter. You're a star, boy, I'll tell you. So, Mrs. Boggins is his mother, and Mrs. Ward is his grandmother, and Mrs. Bastin is his great-grandmother, Mrs. Lewis is his great-great-grandmother, and this Mrs. Lewis is his great-great-great-grandmother. There, how about that? You can have a look at him. He's in good shape as well, isn't he? Yeah. Now, in the United Kingdom, as far as we know, this is the only family who have ever had 6 generations living at the same time. That means, of course, that this Mrs. Lewis is the only Briton ever to have lived to become a great-great-great-granny. Mrs. Lewis, aren't you proud of yourself?
I am very.
Yes?
Yes.
It's very kind of you to bring your family up from Southampton to see us.
Yes, I'm glad of that too. I'm very proud.
Well, you're looking in very good shape.
Yes, thank you.
What's it like to be a great-great-great-granny?
Well, I could hardly realise it myself.
Yeah? Do they make a fuss of you?
They do sometimes.
Yes.
Yes, oh yes.
And what do you think of your great-great-great-grandson?
I think he's a bonny little chap.
He's a good one. He's the
Oh,
only
he
one.
is.
The only one in Britain, you know.
He is, yes.
As far as we
yes.
know. Yeah, and
Really?
he's got a grip of steel on him. Look at that.
Yes, we should be proud of him, shouldn't we?
You certainly should, yes, yes.